Hello. I am still going through the missions for the preliminary Danish mission, Danish Nationals pack. Um, I reached key positions. It's another book mission, um, and this one is one where you really need to look at the table and think before you do something. That's my best suggestion. Because you have D3 plus two objectives on the table. These these objectives will be poker chip sized objectives, and it's the center of the objective that counts. So not the edge, but the center. In order to hold such an objective, you have to have an infantry or artillery model within 3 inches of the center. So this means that your infantry is really, really important for this scenario. And all other units, vehicles, can only contest such an objective. So they can't take it, they can contest it. Where like both sides have a unit within 3 inches of this objective, right? So when you're playing key positions, think very carefully about what your army wants to do. Do you have troops that are good at close combat, that have SMGs, that maybe have tough fighter? Then you really want to have your objectives clumped together so that you can move onto those objectives and fight off the enemy. Unless, of course, if his army is good at that also. There's a balance there, right? If you have a lot of artillery, if you have a lot of support units, you might want to have some of the objectives pushed out to the edges of the board, where you can put an artillery piece on one of these objectives and just sit there shooting out of cover, for instance. If you have stuff that's mobile, maybe you have a flamethrower team in a jeep or something, then you might want to have the objectives pushed out to the sides where your upflankers could come in and get onto the objective or clear the objective. So those are the considerations that you have to think about when you're placing the objectives, right? Because you roll off, and the person who wins gets to place the first objective, and this really can be an advantage. And you can really you can take chances when you do that. So what you can do, if you get an odd number of objectives, right? You roll that D3 plus 2, so you might have 3 objectives, you might have 5. If you get an odd number, and if you get to place them, you might load up one side of the table. That's a huge risk, because if you load up one side of the table, like have 2 objectives on one side and the opponent have 1 on the other, if the opponent gets to decide who picks the first side, right? He can take the one with the 2 objectives. But if you get it, then you have a huge advantage. So you can, like 50-50, load up one side of the table and then grab that one and then fight off the enemy when he tries to push. Because he's going to have to. Each objective is worth 2 points. And there are no kill points in this scenario. You deploy via first wave, and you can use outflank, and you can use reserves, but there are no units that start on the table, even forward deployers. So no forward deployment. And I think this is an interpretation from where many people have played it in the rulebook previously. Many people have played it that you can have forward deployers. This interpretation comes from the Warlord Games competitive pack, where you cannot have forward deployers in key positions. And I think, yes, that messes up some people's game, but you really need to read this. And you need to think about forward deployers. If they can be deployed in all missions, then they become really, really good. So if you want a balance in the missions. You're going to have to give and take. Some missions are going to have to be without forward deployers, and this is one of them. So yeah, would you want to have stuff in outflank or reserve? Well, that really depends on if you get to load up one side of the table. Reserves might be a good idea, because you can wait and see where the opponent gets in. Normally I don't. I normally put everything in first wave, because I want my stuff on the table where it can affect the game, right? If your stuff is off the table, it can't affect the game, and you're going to have to rely on dice rolls to get them onto the table. So quite often you'll see players not using that. But you will see players using outflank in this scenario, especially if they have like a jeep with a flamethrower. They'll put one or two of the objectives in the edges of the board, and then their outflankers will jump onto them and attack them. That happens quite a lot. It has happened to me. You can lose games if they do that. So be ready for that. Be aware of if your opponent uses outflankers, have something that's on ambush to counter that push, because he is going to jump onto objectives, which is of course something where you can also sort of guess where his outflankers are going to come, right? Because they are going to come where that objective sits. Also, I would like you to think about, you don't need to be on the objectives early. The objectives only count in turn 6 or 7 if it goes to turn 7, the game, right? So it's only at the end of the game that you really need to be on them. So try to kill something of the opponents in the early game, like the first 3 turns, and then move onto the objectives. If you can, have something ready to run up and contest objectives that the enemy is holding. It's not always possible to do that, but it's a good idea, because if you're contesting his objective and you're holding one objective, you win, right? The one who holds one more objective than the opponent wins, because they're 2 points each. So yeah, I think that was my advice for how to play key positions. Most of you should have done this many times before. It's a fairly common mission, and it's one that's really good for competitive play. Right. Cheers.